82 years ago, during the Battle of Midway, Lieutenant Audie Murphy disappeared without leaving a trace. His absence plunged his family into tragedy and silent mourning, while his squadron and fellow servicemen remained confused by the mystery. Military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but his family never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. June 4, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness over the Pacific was broken by the mechanical symphony of aircraft engines warming up aboard the USS Enterprise. Lieutenant Audie Murphy, 23 years old and fresh-faced despite 6 months of combat experience, performed his ritual pre-flight check with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through previous engagements. His Grumman F-4F Wildcat, tail number painted in bold white letters, sat ready on the carrier deck like a sleeping predator. Murphy had written to his wife Sarah the night before, a letter that would never be sent. In it, he described the strange calm that had settled over the fleet, as intelligence reports confirmed what everyone suspected. The Japanese were coming in force. Admiral Nimitz's codebreakers had given them the advantage of knowing when and where, but knowledge and survival were different currencies in aerial combat. The morning briefing had been terse and efficient. Commander Wade McCluskey outlined the mission parameters. Locate and engage the Japanese carrier fleet approaching from the northwest. Intelligence suggested 4 carriers, heavily protected by Zero fighters and supported by battleships and cruisers. It would be the largest naval engagement in Pacific theater history. Murphy's squadron, VF-6, was assigned to provide fighter escort for the torpedo bombers of VT-6. The Devastators were slow, vulnerable aircraft that required constant protection to reach their targets. It was dangerous work, the kind that separated experienced pilots from those who wouldn't see another sunset. As Murphy climbed into his cockpit, his crew chief, Petty Officer James Mitchell, handed him his lucky charm, a small wooden cross carved by his grandfather. "Bring her back in one piece, Lieutenant," Mitchell said, patting the Wildcat's fuselage. Murphy nodded, tucking the cross into his flight suit pocket. The launch sequence began at 600 hours. One by one, the Wildcats roared down the Enterprise's deck and lifted into the pale morning sky. Murphy was fourth in the formation, maintaining perfect interval as the squadron assembled over the carrier. Below them, the steel-grey Pacific stretched endlessly, hiding an enemy fleet somewhere beyond the horizon. Radio chatter was minimal as they flew northwest. The torpedo bombers struggled to maintain formation speed, their heavy ordnance making them sluggish and predictable. Murphy's job was to keep the Zeros away from these sitting ducks, long enough for them to drop their torpedoes and escape. At 0742 hours, the Japanese fleet appeared like toys scattered on a blue table. 4 aircraft carriers arranged in a defensive box formation, surrounded by screening vessels that looked like white ants from their altitude. But what caught Murphy's attention immediately was the cloud of black specks rising from the carrier decks. Dozens of Zero fighters climbing rapidly to meet them. The radio crackled with terse commands as the American formation began to disperse for the attack. The torpedo bombers descended toward their targets, while the Wildcats moved to intercept the ascending Zeros. Murphy banked hard to starboard, following his flight leader into what would become one of the most chaotic air battles in naval history. The last confirmed radio transmission from Lieutenant Audie Murphy came at 0758 hours. 2 Zeros on my tail, engaging. After that, only silence. The chaos of aerial combat over Midway was unlike anything the Pacific theater had witnessed. Within minutes of first contact, the ordered formations of both sides dissolved into a 3-dimensional maze of diving, climbing, and turning aircraft. Tracer rounds carved brilliant arcs through the morning sky, while the thunder of engines and gunfire echoed across the water. Lieutenant Murphy had trained for this moment through countless hours of gunnery practice and tactical exercises, but no simulation could prepare him for the sensory overload of actual combat. The smell of cordite mixed with engine exhaust, the G-forces that pressed him into his seat during tight turns, and the constant radio chatter of pilots calling out targets and threats. His wingman, Ensign Robert Bobby Hayes, managed to stay close during the initial engagement. Hayes later recalled seeing Murphy's Wildcat perform a diving attack on a Zero that was pursuing one of the torpedo bombers. "Audie came down like a hawk," Hayes would write in his after-action report. His guns were chattering, and I saw strikes on the Zero's port wing. The Japanese pilot pulled up into a steep climb, probably hit, but the victory was short-lived. As Murphy pulled out of his dive, 2 more Zeros appeared from above, diving at steep angles with their guns blazing. This was when Murphy transmitted his final radio message: 2 Zeros on my tail, engaging. What happened next would remain a mystery for 82 years. Hayes attempted to assist his squadron mate, but his own aircraft was immediately engaged by another Zero. During the violent maneuvering that followed, Hayes lost sight of Murphy's Wildcat. "I looked everywhere during the brief moments I could spare," he later testified during the missing aircraft investigation. "1 second Audie was there, fighting like hell, and the next he was gone, just vanished into the chaos." The Battle of Midway raged for hours across hundreds of square miles of ocean. American dive bombers scored devastating hits on 3 Japanese carriers, turning the tide of the Pacific War. But victory came at a cost. 15 American aircraft were lost, including Murphy's Wildcat. Of those 15, 14 crashes could be accounted for through witness testimony, wreckage sightings, or pilot rescues. Only Audie Murphy simply disappeared. The immediate search efforts were hampered by the ongoing battle. Destroyers and cruisers were engaged with Japanese surface vessels, and every available aircraft was either attacking enemy ships or defending American forces. By the time organized search and rescue operations could begin, Murphy had been missing for over 6 hours. Lieutenant Commander John Jack Davidson, Murphy's squadron leader, organized search flights as soon as tactical conditions allowed. "We flew grid patterns for 2 days, Davidson recorded in his log, checked every oil slick, every piece of floating debris. The boys were determined to find Audie, dead or alive. The searches revealed the brutal mathematics of naval aviation. Scattered across the Pacific were the remains of aircraft from both sides, pieces of wing, sections of fuselage, life rafts both occupied and empty, but nothing that could be definitively identified as Murphy's F-4F Wildcat. On June 7th, 3 days after the battle, a reconnaissance pilot reported spotting what appeared to be an aircraft engine block on a coral reef approximately 40 miles southeast of Midway. The location was too dangerous for surface vessels to investigate due to Japanese submarine activity, and by the time a follow-up flight could be arranged, heavy weather had moved through the area. When the skies cleared, the mysterious object was gone. The official incident report filed 2 weeks later listed Lieutenant Audie Murphy as missing in action, presumed killed in aerial combat over Midway Atoll. The terse, bureaucratic language offered no comfort to those who knew him, and certainly none to the young woman waiting in San Diego, who still believed her husband might come home. The USS Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor on June 13, 1942, her flight decks scarred by battle and her crew exhausted by victory. Among the personal effects collected from the missing aircrew was a small bundle of letters from Lieutenant Murphy's locker. The letters were addressed to his wife Sarah, written during the long nights at sea but never mailed. Navy protocol dictated that personal effects of missing personnel be held for 90 days before being forwarded to next of kin. During those 3 months, Sarah Murphy received only the standard telegram informing her that her husband was missing in action. No details, no explanations, just the crushing weight of uncertainty that would define the rest of her life. The first letter, dated June 2nd, revealed Murphy's state of mind in his final days. "My dearest Sarah, we're heading towards something big. I can feel it in the air, the way the old-timers get quiet and check their gear twice. I think about you and the baby constantly. When this is over, I want to buy that little house in Pasadena we looked at. I want to teach our child to ride a bicycle and throw a baseball. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know which places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach." The second letter, written after receiving intelligence about the approaching Japanese fleet, was more somber. "I won't lie to you, sweetheart. Tomorrow might be rough, but I have good men around me, and we have surprise on our side. If something happens to me, know that my last thoughts will be of you and our unborn child. Take care of yourself and don't let anyone tell you I was a hero. I'm just a guy from Texas trying to do his job." The final letter, never finished, contained only a few lines. "Sarah, the dawn is coming and we're preparing to launch. I hear our baby's first cry and the sound of these engines starting up. Strange how your mind works when you might be—" The sentence ended there, interrupted by the call to man aircraft. When these letters finally reached Sarah Murphy in September 1942, she was 7 months pregnant and living with her parents in San Diego. Her younger sister Margaret later described finding Sarah on the kitchen floor, clutching the unfinished letter and sobbing uncontrollably. She kept saying, he knew something was going to happen, over and over again. The baby, a son, was born on November 15, 1942. Sarah named him Audie Jr., though she would spend the next decades wondering if she was making him the son of a dead man or missing father who might someday return. The bureaucratic maze that military families navigated during wartime was particularly cruel to those with missing loved ones. Unlike the families of confirmed casualties, Sarah received no life insurance benefits, no widow's pension, and no official recognition of her husband's sacrifice. Technically, he was still listed as active duty, missing in action. Sarah's father, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Frank Morrison, became her advocate in dealing with military bureaucracy. Every month for 2 years, he wrote letters to the Navy Department requesting updates on the search for his son-in-law. The responses, when they came at all, were form letters expressing sympathy but offering no new information. In 1944, when the statistical probability of Murphy's survival had dropped to essentially 0, Sarah received a visit from Lieutenant Commander Davidson, Murphy's former squadron leader. Davidson had survived the war and was rotating back to the States. He brought with him Murphy's lucky cross, recovered from his abandoned locker. "Your husband was one of the finest pilots I ever served with," Davidson told her. "He saved lives that day at Midway, probably more than we'll ever know. The torpedo bombers he was escorting sank 2 Japanese carriers. That wouldn't have happened without men like Audie keeping the zeros off their backs." Sarah accepted the cross, but Davidson's words offered little comfort. She didn't want her husband to be a hero. She wanted him to be alive, helping her raise their son, complaining about dirty diapers and celebrating first steps. The official presumptive death declaration came in September 1945, exactly 3 years after Sarah had received Audie's final letters. The timing was particularly bitter, the same week that Japan formally surrendered, ending the war that had taken her husband. But Sarah Murphy never accepted that declaration as final. Deep in her heart, she believed that somewhere in the vast Pacific, evidence of what happened to Audie still existed, waiting to be found. The years immediately following World War II were marked by a national desire to move forward, to celebrate victory and build a prosperous future. For most Americans, the war became a proud memory of triumph over evil, but for families like the Murphys, the silence of unanswered questions grew heavier with each passing year. Sarah Murphy rebuilt her life with the determined efficiency of a military spouse, but the architecture of that new life was constructed around an empty space. She took a job as a secretary at a San Diego aircraft plant, raised her son alone, and maintained the fiction that Audie might someday walk through the front door. His coffee cup remained in the kitchen cabinet. His clothes hung in the closet. His side of the bed stayed unslept in until Audie Jr. was old enough to crawl in beside his mother during thunderstorms. Young Audie grew up with a ghost for a father. The living room mantel displayed his father's military portrait alongside his medals and commendations, but these tangible artifacts couldn't fill the absence at birthday parties, school plays, and Little League games. The boy learned early not to ask too many questions about his father, because each inquiry brought fresh pain to his mother's eyes. The American Legion post in Sarah's neighborhood included several Midway veterans, men who had served on different ships but remembered the battle vividly. These grizzled warriors became unofficial father figures to young Audie, teaching him to throw a curveball and change a tire, but they also carried their own burden of survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived while better men like Murphy had vanished into the Pacific. Chief Petty Officer James Mitchell, Murphy's former crew chief, sought out Sarah in 1948. He had left the Navy and was working at the Consolidated Aircraft plant where Sarah was employed. "I keep thinking about that last morning," he told her during their first conversation. Lieutenant Murphy was calm, focused. He didn't seem worried about the mission. If he was scared, he didn't show it. Mitchell's account contradicted some of the official reports, which suggested that Murphy had been anxious or distracted before the mission. "The Navy wants everything neat and tidy," Mitchell explained. "They don't like mysteries, so they create explanations that sound reasonable, even if they're not completely accurate. This conversation planted the first seeds of Sarah's growing suspicion that the official version of events might be incomplete or deliberately misleading. She began requesting copies of all documentation related to her husband's disappearance, using the connections she had developed through her work in the defense industry. The files she eventually received were heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out for reasons of national security. Even nearly a decade after the war's end, the Navy maintained that certain details about the Midway engagement remained classified. The obvious question was, what could possibly still be sensitive about a battle that had been thoroughly documented in newspapers and history books? Sarah's suspicions deepened when she discovered discrepancies between different official accounts. The initial incident report stated that Murphy's aircraft was last seen engaging enemy fighters at 07:58 hours, but a separate intelligence summary indicated that radar contacts consistent with American aircraft were tracked as late as 8:30 hours in the same general area. 32 minutes might not seem significant in the context of a large battle, but to Sarah, those unaccounted minutes represented potential evidence that her husband had survived longer than officially reported. Perhaps long enough to attempt an emergency landing, or to reach one of the many small islands scattered throughout the Midway chain. In 1952, Sarah hired a private investigator named Daniel Cross, a former Navy intelligence officer who specialized in tracking down missing servicemen. Cross was expensive, but Sarah had been saving every spare dollar for 7 years, driven by an obsession that her family considered unhealthy. Cross's investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies in the Navy's record-keeping. Several aircraft reported as shot down during the Battle of Midway had been subsequently discovered crashed on remote islands, their pilots either rescued years later or found deceased at crash sites. But these discoveries were often classified as intelligence operations rather than search and rescue missions, buried in files that families never saw. The Navy has good reasons for keeping some of this information classified, Cross explained to Sarah, but those reasons don't necessarily have anything to do with your husband's fate. Sometimes bureaucracy creates secrecy out of habit rather than necessity. Cross's most significant finding was the existence of a classified photo reconnaissance mission conducted in late 1943, more than a year after the battle. The mission had photographed several previously uncharted coral atolls southeast of Midway, the same general area where wreckage had been spotted immediately after the battle. The photographs from that mission remained classified, but Cross was able to confirm that anomalous objects had been identified on at least 3 separate atolls. Whether those objects were aircraft wreckage, natural formations, or debris from sunken ships remained unknown. Sarah pressed the Navy to declassify the photographs, but her requests were denied on grounds of ongoing intelligence operations. The form letters she received in response were polite, but firm. Some secrets would remain buried indefinitely. Audie Murphy Jr. grew up carrying the weight of a name that belonged to a ghost. As he entered his teenage years in the late 1950s, the boy began asking the questions his mother had long dreaded. Unlike Sarah, who clung to hope that her husband might somehow still be alive, Audie Jr. wanted definitive answers about how his father had died. The differences in their approaches to the mystery created tension in the Murphy household. Sarah continued her correspondence with Navy officials and her payments to private investigator Daniel Cross, while her son embraced a more direct approach. At age 16, Audie Jr. began learning to fly, determined to understand the world that had claimed his father. His flight instructor was Bob Hayes, the same pilot who had served as his father's wingman during the Battle of Midway. Hayes had left active duty in 1946, but remained in the Naval Reserve, and he operated a small flight school at Montgomery Field. When Sarah brought her son for his first lesson, Hayes was visibly shaken by the family resemblance. "He has his father's hands," Hayes told Sarah after watching Audie Jr. work through basic flight controls. "Same way of gripping the stick, same instinctive feel for the aircraft's balance." Under Hayes's instruction, Audie Jr. quickly mastered single-engine aircraft and began training in more complex machines. His goal was clear. He wanted to join the Navy and become a carrier pilot like his father. But more immediately, he hoped that understanding aerial combat might provide insights into what had happened over Midway. Hayes was initially reluctant to discuss the battle in detail, but as Audie Jr.'s skills improved, the older pilot began sharing more specific memories. The conversations usually took place during post-flight debriefings, when the student pilot would press for tactical details about air-to-air combat. "Your father was in a diving attack when I last saw him," Hayes explained during one such session in 1959. "He was pursuing a Zero that had gotten behind one of our torpedo bombers. Classic defensive maneuver, exactly what we trained for. But when you dive on an enemy fighter, you become vulnerable to his wingman or other aircraft in the area." This detail contradicted the official report, which stated that Murphy had been engaged in defensive maneuvering when he disappeared. Hayes's account suggested that Murphy had been aggressively engaging the enemy, possibly pursuing a damaged Japanese fighter away from the main battle area. "Why didn't you include this in your official statement?" Audie Jr. asked. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, staring across the airfield toward the Pacific Ocean. "Son, when you lose a wingman in combat, you replay every second in your mind for the rest of your life. But sometimes what you remember and what officially happened are two different things. The Navy needed clear reports for families and for history. My confused memories of a chaotic battle weren't going to help anyone." As Audie Jr. progressed through advanced flight training, he began developing his own theories about his father's disappearance. The official presumption was that Murphy's aircraft had been shot down by Japanese fighters and crashed into the ocean. But the lack of witnesses, debris, or any physical evidence suggested other possibilities. What if his father had been forced to make an emergency landing on one of the many small islands southeast of Midway? What if he had survived the initial combat but been stranded on a remote atoll with no means of communication? What if the classified photographs that Daniel Cross had discovered actually showed evidence of his crash site? In 1962, shortly before graduating from high school, Audie Jr. made a decision that would define the next phase of his life. Instead of accepting his appointment to the Naval Academy, he chose to study aeronautical engineering at UC San Diego. His plan was to combine technical knowledge of aircraft performance with his growing understanding of the Battle of Midway to create a systematic search for his father's crash site. Sarah was devastated by her son's decision to forgo a military career, but she recognized the same determined obsession that had driven her own search efforts. "He's more like his father than I realized," she confided to her sister Margaret. "Stubborn, methodical, and absolutely convinced he can solve problems that have stumped everyone else." Audie Jr.'s engineering studies focused heavily on aircraft accident investigation and materials analysis. He learned how metal components behave under different environmental stresses, how aircraft break apart during crashes, and how wreckage patterns can reveal the circumstances of an accident. Most significantly, he began studying oceanography and marine archaeology, fields that were rapidly advancing thanks to new underwater exploration technologies. If his father's aircraft had crashed in the Pacific, the wreckage would still be there, preserved in the cold, dark waters thousands of feet below the surface. The question wasn't whether evidence of Lieutenant Audie Murphy's fate still existed. The question was whether anyone had the knowledge, technology, and determination necessary to find it. By the mid-1960s, Audie Murphy Jr. had transformed from a grieving son into a methodical investigator, with both technical expertise and access to emerging technologies. His engineering degree had led to a position with General Dynamics, where he worked on underwater vehicle systems for both military and civilian applications. More importantly, this job gave him connections within the oceanographic research community. The breakthrough came in 1967, when declassified documents from World War II revealed the existence of Operation Neptune's Garden, a classified Navy program that had used primitive sonar equipment to map aircraft wrecks in the Pacific. The program, conducted between 1945 and 1948, had been designed to recover valuable technology from downed American aircraft before it could be salvaged by foreign governments. Among the dozens of wrecks catalogued by Neptune's Garden were several unidentified F-4F Wildcat crashes in the Midway area. The coordinates were approximate, based on 1940s navigation technology, but they provided the first concrete leads that the Murphy family had received in 25 years. Audie Jr. spent months correlating the Neptune's Garden coordinates with his father's last known position and the flight paths of other aircraft from VF-6. Using computer analysis, a revolutionary approach in 1967, he narrowed the search area to 3 possible locations within a 40-mile radius of Midway Atoll. If this case has already captured your attention, hit the like button. It helps Lieutenant Murphy's story reach more people. The challenge was accessing these remote areas of the Pacific Ocean. The water depth ranged from 800 to 2,400 feet, far beyond the reach of conventional diving equipment. The technology to explore such depths existed, but it was expensive and typically reserved for military or major commercial operations. Sarah Murphy, now 52 years old and still working to support her son's increasingly expensive research efforts, had spent nearly all of her savings on private investigators and document requests. The family needed outside financial support to fund an actual underwater search operation. The solution came from an unexpected source: Dr. Robert Ballard, a young marine geologist who would later become famous for discovering the Titanic, was conducting research for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on deep-sea wreck preservation. Ballard's work was funded by the Navy, which was interested in understanding how long sensitive materials might remain intact in ocean environments. Audie Jr. approached Ballard with a proposal: use the search for his father's aircraft as a test case for deep-sea archaeological techniques. The Navy had strategic interest in understanding aircraft wreck sites, and the Murphy family's decades of research had provided more precise target coordinates than most historical searches could offer. Ballard agreed to include one of the Murphy search coordinates in his 1968 research expedition, provided the family could cover additional equipment costs. Sarah Murphy took out a second mortgage on her house to fund the project. The expedition used the research vessel Lulu and its submersible Alvin, one of the few vehicles capable of reaching the depths where Murphy's Wildcat might rest. The first dive, conducted on August 15, 1968, descended to a depth of 1,847 feet at coordinates that corresponded to the most probable crash location based on Audie Jr.'s analysis. The ocean floor in this area was a mixture of sand, coral debris, and volcanic rock formations. Visibility was limited, but Alvin's powerful lights illuminated a bottom that had remained undisturbed for millennia. For the first hour of the dive, the submersible's cameras recorded only natural geological features. Then, at 1,823 feet, they found something that didn't belong. Partially buried in sediment and encrusted with marine growth was the unmistakable outline of an aircraft engine. The radial configuration and approximate size were consistent with the Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine that powered F4F Wildcats. More significantly, portions of the engine block bore markings that were still partially visible after 26 years underwater. Dr. Ballard maneuvered Alvin closer to the wreckage, using the submersible's mechanical arm to carefully clear sediment from the engine block. What they found sent shockwaves through both the research team and the Murphy family, clearly visible serial numbers that could be traced back to specific aircraft. The engine serial number was recorded as 831-4429B. According to Navy maintenance records, that engine had been installed in F4F Wildcat Bureau number 5094, the aircraft assigned to Lieutenant Audie Murphy on June 4, 1942. After 26 years of searching, the Murphy family had finally found evidence of what happened to their missing husband and father. The discovery of Lieutenant Murphy's aircraft engine created both elation and frustration for his family. While they now had proof of where his Wildcat had crashed, the wreckage site raised new questions about the circumstances of his disappearance. The engine's location, nearly 2,000 feet underwater and 43 miles southeast of Midway, suggested that Murphy had flown much farther from the main battle area than any official report had indicated. Dr. Ballard's team conducted 3 additional dives to the crash site during their 1968 expedition. Each dive revealed more pieces of the puzzle, scattered across several hundred yards of ocean floor. The aircraft had clearly broken apart during impact, but the distribution pattern was unusual for a high-speed crash. Normally, when an aircraft hits the water at combat speeds, the debris field is relatively compact, Dr. Ballard explained to Audie Jr. during a post-expedition briefing. But your father's Wildcat is spread out like it came apart in the air, or perhaps ditched at a much slower speed. This observation supported a theory that Audie Jr. had been developing based on his aeronautical engineering studies. Rather than being shot down in aerial combat, his father might have attempted a controlled emergency landing on the ocean surface. Such ditchings were extremely dangerous, but they offered better survival odds than a high-speed crash. The most significant discovery came during the fourth dive, when Alvin's cameras located what appeared to be the aircraft's cockpit section, partially buried under a coral overhang. The plexiglass canopy was long gone, dissolved by decades of seawater, but the metal framework remained largely intact. Inside the cockpit, preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor environment of the deep ocean, were personal artifacts that brought the human dimension of the tragedy into sharp focus. Dr. Ballard's team recovered a waterlogged leather wallet, corroded metal objects that might have been instruments or personal items, and most significantly, a small wooden cross that had somehow survived the crash and 26 years underwater. The cross was identical to the one that Sarah had received from Lieutenant Commander Davidson, the lucky charm that Murphy's crew chief had given him before every mission. The discovery confirmed that Murphy had been in his aircraft when it hit the water, ending decades of speculation about whether he might have bailed out or been taken prisoner. But the cross also raised disturbing questions about Navy search and rescue efforts in 1942. If Murphy's aircraft had indeed attempted a controlled ditching, he might have survived the initial crash. The discovery of the cockpit in relatively good condition suggested that the aircraft's structure had remained intact long enough for a pilot to potentially escape. The terrible possibility, Audie Jr. wrote in his journal that night, is that my father survived the crash but died waiting for rescue that never came. This theory was supported by additional evidence discovered during subsequent analysis of the wreckage. Marine biologist Dr. Helen Chen, who examined the artifacts recovered from the cockpit, found what appeared to be improvised signaling devices, pieces of metal that had been arranged in patterns consistent with distress signals. Someone was definitely alive in this aircraft after it hit the water, Dr. Chen reported. These metal fragments show evidence of deliberate manipulation, not random damage from the crash. Your father was trying to signal for help. The implications were devastating for Sarah Murphy, who had spent 26 years hoping her husband had died quickly in combat rather than suffering a prolonged death. The evidence suggested that Lieutenant Murphy had survived his aircraft's crash, possibly for days or even weeks, before succumbing to exposure or injuries. More disturbing was the revelation that search aircraft had indeed flown over the crash site area in June 1942. Radio logs recovered from the National Archives showed that Navy patrol planes had reported unidentified surface objects in the same general coordinates where Murphy's wreckage now rested. The search efforts had been called off after only 72 hours, deemed too dangerous due to ongoing Japanese submarine activity. But the crash site was within range of rescue aircraft, and Murphy's improvised signals might have been visible from the air during those critical first days. The Navy had priorities, explained Captain retired Thomas Morrison, a Midway veteran who helped analyze the search records. They couldn't risk additional aircraft and crews to search for one missing pilot when the battle was still ongoing. It's a harsh calculation, but it's the reality of combat operations. For the Murphy family, this harsh calculation represented a betrayal of the military's commitment to leave no man behind. Their loved one had survived his aircraft's crash, had attempted to signal for rescue, and had died not because of enemy action, but because his own service had abandoned the search. The discovery transformed Sarah Murphy's grief into anger. After 26 years of accepting official explanations and bureaucratic stonewalling, she now had evidence that her husband's death might have been preventable. They left him out there, she told her sister Margaret. They knew approximately where he was and they left him to die. The discovery of Lieutenant Murphy's aircraft wreckage should have provided closure for his family, but instead it opened new wounds and created fresh conflicts with military bureaucracy. The Navy's initial response to Dr. Ballard's findings was cautious and defensive, focusing more on protecting institutional reputation than acknowledging decades of incomplete information provided to the Murphy family. Captain James Fletcher, the Navy's liaison for historical aircraft recovery operations, met with Sarah and Audie Jr. Murphy in October 1968 to discuss the official implications of the wreckage discovery. Fletcher's mandate was clear: acknowledge the finding while minimizing any suggestion that previous investigations had been inadequate or deliberately misleading. The important thing, Fletcher explained, is that we now have definitive proof of Lieutenant Murphy's fate. Your family can finally have the closure you've sought for so many years. But Sarah Murphy was no longer interested in closure. The evidence of her husband's survival after the crash and the possibility that he might have been rescued if search efforts had continued, had transformed her grief into a demand for accountability. "You're asking us to be grateful that you finally found what you should have looked for in 1942, Sarah responded. "My husband didn't die in combat. He died because the Navy gave up on him." The confrontation reflected a broader tension between institutional interests and individual tragedy. The Navy had genuine strategic reasons for limiting search operations during active combat, but those decisions had human costs that extended far beyond the battlefield. Audie Jr., thus now 26 years old, and equipped with both technical knowledge and bitter experience of military bureaucracy, approached the situation more systematically than his mother. Instead of seeking apologies or admissions of wrongdoing, he focused on ensuring that his father's sacrifice received appropriate recognition. The process of upgrading Lieutenant Murphy's status from missing in action to killed in action required extensive documentation and review by multiple military boards. Each step in the bureaucratic process revealed new examples of how wartime expediency had created lasting injustices for military families. Murphy's personnel file, when finally released in complete form, showed that he had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross based on his actions during the Battle of Midway. The recommendation had been submitted by Lieutenant Commander Davidson just days after the battle, but it had been shelved pending resolution of Murphy's missing status. For 26 years, the award had remained in administrative limbo. Murphy was considered missing, not dead, so the decoration couldn't be awarded posthumously. But he was also presumed dead, so it couldn't be presented to him personally. The bureaucratic catch-22 had effectively erased his heroism from official records. The discovery of his wreckage broke this deadlock, but it also revealed the broader scope of how many World War II servicemen had been forgotten by similar administrative complications. Murphy's case was unusual only because his family had the resources and determination to pursue it for decades. Audie Jr.'s research identified at least 17 other pilots from the Battle of Midway who remained officially listed as missing in action, despite strong evidence of their deaths. Some had been witnessed crashing into the ocean, but their aircraft had never been recovered. Others had been reported as possible prisoners of war, but no confirmation had ever been received. The military created categories for people who didn't fit into neat bureaucratic boxes, Audie Jr. observed. MIA became a way of avoiding difficult decisions about death benefits, medals, and official recognition. The campaign to secure appropriate recognition for Lieutenant Murphy became a model for other military families dealing with similar circumstances. Sarah and Audie Jr. worked with veterans organizations and congressional representatives to highlight the systemic problems that left families in bureaucratic limbo. The breakthrough came in March 1969 when Senator Alan Cranston of California introduced legislation requiring the military to periodically review all MIA cases and make definitive determinations based on available evidence. The Murphy case served as the primary example of how administrative inaction had compounded the trauma of military families. Lieutenant Audie Murphy was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony at Naval Air Station North Island on June 4, 1969, exactly 27 years after his disappearance. Sarah Murphy, now 54 years old, accepted the decoration on behalf of her husband and son. But the medal ceremony was overshadowed by revelations about other classified aspects of the Battle of Midway. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird announced that previously classified documents would be released, showing the full scope of American losses during the battle, including cases like Murphy's, where incomplete information had been provided to families. The declassified documents revealed that the Battle of Midway had cost significantly more American lives than previously acknowledged. The official casualty figures had excluded personnel listed as MIA, creating an artificially low death toll that minimized the battle's human cost. "We owed these families the truth," Secretary Laird stated. "Even painful truth is better than decades of uncertainty." For Sarah Murphy, the official recognition came too late to heal wounds that had defined her adult life. But for other military families facing similar circumstances, the Murphy case established precedents that would prevent decades of bureaucratic neglect. The formal recognition of Lieutenant Audie Murphy's sacrifice in 1969 marked the end of one chapter in his family's long journey, but it also began a new phase of their relationship with his memory. The physical evidence of his crash, resting nearly 2,000 feet below the Pacific surface, had provided answers to decades-old questions while creating new responsibilities for preserving his story. Audie Jr., now approaching his 30th birthday, made a decision that would define the remainder of his life. Rather than viewing the discovery of his father's wreckage as the conclusion of their search, he chose to see it as the beginning of a broader mission to locate other missing servicemen from World War II. The techniques developed during the search for his father's aircraft, combining historical research, computer analysis, and deep-sea exploration technology, could be applied to hundreds of similar cases. The National Archives contained files on more than 78,000 American servicemen who remained missing from World War II, many of whom had disappeared in circumstances similar to Lieutenant Murphy's. Working with Dr. Ballard and other oceanographic researchers, Audie Jr. established the Deep Recovery Foundation in 1971. The organization's mission was to locate and identify aircraft wrecks from World War II, providing closure for families while advancing understanding of aviation archaeology. Sarah Murphy, despite her advancing age and declining health, became the Foundation's most effective advocate. Her 3 decades of experience navigating military bureaucracy had taught her which officials could be trusted, which documents contained useful information, and which bureaucratic obstacles could be overcome through persistence. She knew more about Navy personnel records than most active duty administrators, recalled Dr. Patricia Williams, who worked with Sarah on several recovery missions. But more importantly, she understood the emotional needs of families who were still waiting for answers. The Foundation's first major success came in 1973 with the discovery of a B-25 bomber that had crashed in the Pacific during the Doolittle raid. The aircraft contained the remains of 3 airmen who had been listed as missing for 31 years. The recovery operation, conducted using techniques pioneered during the Murphy search, provided definitive closure for their families. Over the following decade, Deep Recovery Foundation located wreckage from 47 World War II aircraft, identifying the remains of more than 200 servicemen. Each discovery followed the same methodical process that Audie Jr. had developed while searching for his father: exhaustive historical research, computer-assisted analysis of probable crash locations, and carefully planned deep-sea exploration. But the Foundation's most significant contribution wasn't technological. It was bureaucratic. The organization's success in locating missing servicemen forced the military to reevaluate its policies regarding MIA cases and family notification. The standard assumption that missing personnel were dead, while statistically reasonable, had prevented systematic efforts to recover remains and provide definitive answers. Sarah Murphy lived to see many of these changes implemented. Before her death in 1984, she witnessed the military's adoption of new protocols for family notification, expanded funding for remains recovery operations, and congressional legislation requiring periodic review of MIA cases. Her final years were spent writing memoirs that documented not only her personal journey, but also the experiences of dozens of other military families. Her book, Letters Never Sent: A Wife's Search for Truth, became required reading for military casualty assistance officers and family support specialists. Audie Jr. continued the Foundation's work until his retirement in 2010, by which time Deep Recovery had located wreckage from more than 300 World War II aircraft. The organization's techniques had been adopted by military recovery teams, commercial salvage operations, and academic research institutions worldwide. The site where Lieutenant Murphy's Wildcat rests remains protected as an underwater memorial, designated by the Navy as a military gravesite. No artifacts have been removed since the initial recovery operation, but the location is periodically visited by researchers studying marine preservation of historical materials. In 2019, 77 years after the Battle of Midway, Audie Jr.'s own son, Lieutenant Commander Michael Murphy, flew over his grandfather's crash site during a memorial flight conducted by the Navy's Historical Flight Program. 3 generations of the Murphy family had now been connected by the mystery that began in 1942. The flight was broadcast live on Navy television networks, with Audie Jr. providing commentary from the USS Midway Museum in San Diego. As his son's FA-18 Hornet passed over the coordinates where Lieutenant Murphy's Wildcat rests, Audie Jr. read from his father's final unfinished letter: "Sarah, the dawn is coming, and we're preparing to launch. I hear our baby's first cry in the sound of these engines starting up. The engines of modern naval aviation have changed dramatically since 1942, but they still carry the same hopes and fears of families who send their loved ones into combat. Lieutenant Audie Murphy's story serves as a reminder that behind every missing serviceman is a family whose lives are forever altered by uncertainty, and that the truth, however painful, provides a foundation for healing that official silence never can. The Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets for decades, but it does not keep them forever. In the cold, dark waters where Lieutenant Murphy's aircraft rests, time moves differently than it does for the living. But eventually, persistence and technology converge to bring the past back to the surface, allowing families to finally understand what happened during those crucial moments when their loved ones vanished into history. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Lieutenant Audie Murphy's story. See you in the next video.